Pro et Contra.
Hello and welcome back to another video. I appreciate you all coming for another coverage in search for the truth. It is your host Weeb Union and we're back to cover the latest developments in the Russo-Ukrainian war. In this one there's multiple small advancements by the Russians, the tactical decisions behind those advancements, a coverage of the current state of the war to give you a better idea of what's happening and why, some talk on mis- and disinformation, including map corrections while exposing lies from official sources. And finally, what's next? We start out with the small advancements by the Russians, where they have managed to capture this forest patch west of Pervomaiske. This is to secure the northern flank and push the Ukrainians back. The main advantage the Russians gain by capturing this forest patch is to allow them to push towards the central parts and western parts of Pervomaiske from the northern flank. Combining this with an assault from the eastern parts will allow the Russians to then push the Ukrainians, the final part, out of Pervomaiske and towards Netailove, to then develop the front line towards the fortifications to the north, or simply pushing through Netailove to gain control of the village. At the same time, we see here within Semenivka, due to this geolocated footage, the Russians have advanced further within the village. However, there's been no reports or confirmation that the Russians have captured the fortifications to the west of Semenivka. This means that it remains in the gray zone. With this recent advancement by the Russians here within Semenivka, the Russians now gain control over a third of Semenivka. This is the third advance by the Russians within the village, and with this we see that a third of the village was taken in 3 separate days during 3 separate assaults. Go more on the reason for these small-scale advancements by the Russians later, as we move on towards Bakhmut, where the Russians have captured this small area west of Ivanivske. It is a part of the forest area, allowing the Russians to gain a foothold within it and fully securing the western flank of Ivanivske. Further north, we see positional fighting by the Russians towards the Ukrainian fortifications to the south of the recent advancements, further advancements within the forest patch to the east of Chasiv, and the first foothold gain within the eastern parts of Chasiv. In the northern direction, the Russians have captured this forest patch right here to the east of Bohdanivka, allowing them to flank the Ukrainian positions within Bohdanivka, and we'll likely see further pushing of the Ukrainian forces out of the village and towards the fortifications to the north of the village. All of this in an attempt to push towards the canal line, where the Russians here would be looking to push the Ukrainians over the canal line and gain control over the eastern bank. As for the tactical decisions behind these small advancements by the Russians over really the past year or two, where the Russians have not launched any large-scale offensive operations. The largest offensive operation we have seen since the very initial invasion of the Russians were the Kharkiv, Kherson, and Zaporizhia offensives by the Ukrainians. The Russians have not launched any significant offensive operation since the initial push. Now, we have to take a look at why this is the case. The Russians first started out with a significant invasion force, numbering all the way up to 200,000 soldiers, likely somewhere between 150 and 200,000. The Ukrainians started out with a similar number, around the 200,000, the majority of which were located in the Donbas region, of which 10,000 were in Mariupol and ended up being surrounded by the Russians in the first few days of the war. Following the initial invasion, the Russians pulled back from Kiev and reorganized all of their forces to be focused around the south. The Ukrainians kept hitting the supply lines of the Russians across Dnieper River, which eventually forced the Russians to go back across Dnieper River to re-establish and reorganize their positions in the south to prevent the Ukrainians from gaining more successes like the ones in Kharkiv, where the Russians simply were stretched out too thin, leaving huge gaps in the Russian defenses and forcing them to withdraw beyond the Uskil River line, after which the Ukrainians actually managed to gain a foothold as the Russians had not established their positions to the east of the Uskil River line, leading to the defeat and recapture of Liman by the Ukrainians after a Russian withdrawal from it, which has since then established the defensive line, which we now see across the front line. We see that the Russians built the Surovikin line and other fortifications throughout these months of fighting, where the Ukrainians, after the Kharkiv and Kherson offensives, started building up an armored force to launch their Zaporizhia offensive. Following this gap in time between the Ukrainians waiting for Western equipment to actually build up their ability to launch their offensive operation through the Zaporizhia front, the Russians built all of these fortifications, which allowed them to hold back and defeat the Ukrainian summer offensive. This led to multiple months of the Ukrainians launching small-scale assaults and armored assaults towards the Russian positions across the front, both in the Zaporizhia direction, through Velika Novoselivka, in the direction of Bakhmut, and even in the northern directions by Kreminne. We saw constant Ukrainian efforts to make some sort of advancements. However, Zaluzhny, the then commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, advocated for the Ukrainians to save their equipment for the future, whether it is defensive or offensive operations. There were two main reasons for this. The first one is that Zaluzhny reported that they did not have nearly enough armored equipment to actually launch a successful offensive, much less against these heavily fortified Russian positions. The second reason was the lack of air defense and air support that the Ukrainians suffered from. The Russians had a functioning air force. The Ukrainians had no way to deal with that air force, which led to the Russians heavily making use of that during the Ukrainian summer offensive, which gave the Russians a significant advantage and allowed them to defeat the Ukrainian summer offensive. Following the Ukrainian summer offensive, the Russians launched an offensive operations to capture Avdiivka. This took approximately 4 months from October through November, December, January, before it finally fell in February. This offensive operations by the Russians started out with heavy armored casualties. It included up to 60 armored vehicles destroyed in the first week of the offensive operation, and in total it was somewhere around 100 armored vehicles lost by the Russians to capture Avdiivka. And this is a great example of why the Russians have not launched any significant offensive operations since the start of the war. The main reason for that, as I come to now, covering the recent and most significant developments since the start of the war, is that the Russians are saving up with what they have. The initial Russian invasion force was largely destroyed and spread out across the entirety of Ukraine after the initial invasion. This was due to the Russian army being spread thinly, not having the proper air support and organization of their army, as well as logistical support. The logistics of the Russians were constantly hit by Ukrainian guerrilla warfare in the forest areas in the Kiev direction, and generally by attacking different areas in the southern front. This allowed the Ukrainians to inflict heavy casualties on the Russians. The vast majority of the Russian armored losses are from abandoned vehicles, because the vehicles were damaged to a point in which they were forced to abandon them to save their own lives, or simply go down with the ship, as they say. This meant that the Russians were in a position where they had lost a significant amount of armored vehicles to the point that they couldn't really launch a successful large-scale offensive without taking significant risks. And this brings us to the Russian mobilization in late 2022. The Russians mobilized 300,000 soldiers, and this was to close the gaps throughout the front line, really, but also more importantly to allow the Russians to rotate out forces that had been fighting at that point for almost a year, and at the same time to allow the Russians to move away from the heavily mechanized army that they had to avoid further armored losses, and then push towards having a more infantry-based army. This brings us to this article by the Defense Post. Russia has almost completely rebuilt its military, said a US official. The US official said that the Russians have pretty much almost completely reconstituted their entirety of the initial invading force after the war broke out in February 2022. Previously, US intelligence officials claimed that the Russians would need a decade to fully recover, but now they have fully recovered within 2 years. With this, the Russians are now in a position where they can yet again launched a large-scale massive offensive across the front using mainly armored vehicles to break through the Ukrainian fortifications and defenses and capture major parts of territories like cities like Kharkiv, Dnipro, Zaporizhzhia, Kiev, Odessa, etc. All of this depending on the Russian army capabilities, their success, and how much the Ukrainian army has been grinded down over these 2 years of attritional war. So all in all, the Russians have used a mainly infantry-based army, artillery-based army, FPV drones, and air force to prevent losses of armored vehicles and focus instead on this positional attritional war to grind down the Ukrainian armed forces and build up their own. This has allowed the Russians to now have 1 million soldiers that they can commit to the war in Ukraine, hundreds of, if not thousands of additional tanks, armored vehicles, self-propelled guns, artillery pieces, FPV drones, everything that they need in this war they have mass produced to a level that the West entirety cannot keep up with. The United States says that this is due to help from Iran, China, and North Korea. However, if Iran, China, and North Korea can outproduce the entirety of the West, or help Russia outproduce the entirety of the West, then the problem isn't really there, but instead with the Western industrial capacity and capabilities. Using all of this information, what we can currently see is that the Russians right now are in the final stage before they launch another massive offensive. This final stage is to completely destroy the Ukrainian military-industrial complex and industry, to prevent the Ukrainians from building up and repairing their forces, as well as to hit the Ukrainian supply lines. This is why we are seeing massive strikes on the Ukrainian energy grid, industrial capacity, as well as concentrations of soldiers. At the same time, we are also seeing hits on Ukrainian decision-making centers of their generals and their advisors. At the same time, the Russian tankers and tank casualties had significantly lowered since the Russian mobilization, which has allowed them to build up a significant fleet that is now ready to launch attacks. The Russians have mainly used, since the end of 2022, their tank fleet for additional fire support and to allow Russian infantry to push on and gain access to villages and cities. For example, the recent armored assault by the Russians towards Chasiv was launched with multiple infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, and tanks to gain and drop off the Russian soldiers into the forest patch before driving back and then providing fire support from a distance. Russian tanks can hit targets from up to 5 kilometers away, which is about this distance from Chasiv. So the Russian armored vehicles can be here to the north of Hormove and shoot Ukrainian positions in Chasiv. At the same time, artillery is hitting from much further away. The Russian Air Force is also hitting the Ukrainian positions in the area, and the Ukrainians have to concentrate their forces in the area to prevent the Russian infantry from simply pushing through. This means that the Ukrainians are taking casualties simply by existing in the area to prevent Russian breakthrough. The Russians could, of course, send additional waves of armored vehicles and commit their armored vehicles to gain control much faster or much larger areas. However, this would mean larger armored casualties and lead to the Russians losing their combat abilities, or at the very least their ability to launch a large-scale offensive. The Russians have really been building up while launching this attritional war while grinding down the Ukrainian army. The question is, when is the Russian army ready? That is up for them to decide, so time will tell when this will happen. It will either be this spring, this summer, this winter, or later, whenever the Russians feel like they can securely gain massive gains through a launch of a massive offensive. Finally, about the mis- and disinformation parts, we have this part here, which is that the Ukrainians claimed that they destroyed many Russian planes in an airfield in the Rostov region. However, this recent satellite imagery coming from the night before and the night after the claimed Ukrainian attack, we see that there's no planes destroyed and that the drone strike was averted as Russian sources reported. However, Russian sources aren't always all truthful. This is why we have to define which are truthful and not. As we see here in the direction of Terny, the Russians, according to Syriac maps, never actually launched this offensive operation. It all started with Ukrainian sources claiming that the Russians launched an armored assault, which was thwarted. However, this was something that happened weeks ago and not recently. The Russian sources that were not so reliable ended up saying that the Russians gained a foothold within Terni after pushing through with an armored assault. However, Syriac maps said that no such assault actually happened, and the Russians do not have a foothold within Terni. They did not even launch an attack towards it since the one that failed weeks ago. Finally, what is next? Based on what I've told you so far, I think it is clear to say that what is next is that the Russians will continue this attritional war. There's not going to be any significant attempts by the Russians to capture territory. They'll likely try to identify weak Ukrainian positions to take advantage of. They'll try to gain and improve their positions across the front. There are a few targets that the Russians would like to gain control of, similar to the city of Avdiivka, where they actually launched an armored assault to gain control over the city. However, these are not many, and there are breaks between them because the Russians are looking to use their elite units to do these operations, like the 98th Air Assault Division, which is used by the Russians to launch this attack towards Chasiv. Following the assaults on Avdiivka, the Russians are now using this division to launch attack towards Chasiv. This division was on rotation following the Ukrainian summer offensive and recently returned to launch this offensive operation. So we're seeing that the Russians are regularly rotating their elite units now that they are in this stage of attrition, where they launch these assaults with gaps in between to allow the Russians to concentrate their air force in simple areas. While the Russians were fighting in the heights of the Battle of Avdiivka, hundreds of FAB bombs would launch and land on Avdiivka every day. And now that target is Chasiv, it is being heavily bombarded by the Russian FAB bombs. This allows the Russians to make these advancements under heavy cover of the Russian Air Force and artillery hitting the Ukrainian positions. This is how the Russians look to minimize their casualties by taking important areas. Chasiv is a fortified town located on heights to the northeast of Konstantinivka. The town itself is very significant and important for the Russians if they are looking to advance further towards Konstantinivka. The Russians will use the next few weeks or months until either they launch their summer offensive, the Ukrainian fortifications collapse, or the Russians capture the town to attempt to capture the town. They'll push through to the east of the canal line, then they'll start attacking the flanks to hit the Ukrainian fortifications and hit the Ukrainian supply lines before storming the city itself by pushing through the central parts and crossing over by the forest areas where there are natural crossings across the canal line, which allows the Russians to push through with their infantry and gain control over the forest areas to then push towards the town itself. Following all of this positional fighting and battle of attrition throughout the front, when the Russians identify that the Ukrainians are weak enough or that they themselves have become strong enough, they will launch their offensive operation that will look to capture Kiev and Odessa and end the war. And that is my expectations for the...
Thank you for watching, like and subscribe.